Well, Stuart, thank you very much indeed for coming all this way down to Cornwall from East Anglia. I know you've done about 320 miles, which is a fair old journey, but obviously you have your own farm. You're also the MEP for your area. Which committee do you sit on with the Parliament?
I sit on the Agriculture and Rural Development Committee in Brussels. That committee has about 45 MEPs on it, only half of whom turn up regularly, and only about 8 of those really know anything about farming.
Right, okay. Well, obviously, the purpose of this interview is just to let the public here in Cornwall know of who you are, what you do, and your particular views on whether European law is a good thing for Cornwall or not. So, from a historic point of view, is there anything good that's come out of the EU, please?
I don't think any farmer would dispute that the first 12 years, 1972 to 1984, were simply a real gravy train for agriculture. Every year, guaranteed prices were increased for unlimited quantities of certain commodities with quality specifications that were pretty generous as well.
Right.
So you couldn't fault that as a farmer. But since 1984, the combination there of the introduction of milk quotas and the massive harvest which blew apart the intervention system, we saw then that things can go wrong, and more frequently they have gone wrong over the years. There have been ups as well as downs, but more downs than ups. But now what I want to really get across is that the status quo is no longer on offer. It's going to get worse for agriculture from the European Union. They're not going to be able to support it the way they did.
Right. So you sound a little bit like a prophet of doom. What do you think some of the answers are to these difficulties and problems that we're facing now?
Well, the first is very basic, that our laws should be made by people in this country who we can elect and dismiss. That's
right.
The first critical thing.
Okay.
On agriculture, we need agricultural policies that actually reflect farming in this country and not an attempt to smear a policy across 28 countries that go from commercial reindeer farming in the Arctic Circle all the way down to farming on Mediterranean islands where draft animals are still used. That's why it's no longer working properly. So we need to tailor our agricultural policy to farming in Great Britain. We should strive for food security, and we should make farming possible by not over-regulating it. And this is one of the big problems now coming from Brussels, is just the never-ending flood of regulations. So in that period from 72 to 84 there were very few.
Yeah.
Now there are an awful lot.
Well, I've spoken to many farmers this week, and over half of them were saying they're about to give up because there's just too much bureaucracy. They found it very difficult to make ends meet. It is no longer economically viable. So what kind of things would UKIP put in place to be able to actually assist farmers here in this area in Cornwall?
Well, one of the reasons they're saying that is that if you get your claim forms incorrect, if you don't jump through all the hoops and hurdles that are placed in front of you to get this subsidy, you will get penalised under something called cross-compliance rules, which can take quite a lot of money away from you.
Right.
And once you've been bitten, you don't like it. That frequently is on the identification and movement records of animals.
Right.
That's usually where the farmers slip up. They're obliged to use now something called EID in their sheep flocks. That's electronic individual identification of sheep. This is a technology that doesn't work outdoors in the Cornish air when it's raining and winding, etc. And so if an inspector turns up to the farm and wants to look at things and look at ear tags, they're probably going to be out of order, which means they can get penalised. And the worry of that is enough to make people think, oh, well, I can't be bothered with it. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we will support agriculture. It will be a simplified version of the single farm payment scheme. All you need to do to qualify for it is to farm your farm according to the rules of an environmental scheme that's called the entry-level stewardship scheme.
Right.
This ensures that farms will not be wall-to-wall wheat, that there will be priority given to natural flora and fauna. It's not particularly onerous, but the field margins have to be left. Hedges have to be cut at a certain time of the year. There are various options. Overwintered stubbles is one. Planting wild bird cover plots is another one. It's not particularly difficult, but it does make a huge difference to the environment. So as long as you obey those rules, and this is a scheme that was dreamt up by the British as opposed to the European Union, and so it's relatively straightforward. So you will have to farm your land like that. A grassland farm will automatically qualify, which is what many Cornish farms are, so there's no worry there. That will pay £80 an acre, all in, so you won't get this very high headline figure that people quote from the EU, only to find it hit by 19% modulation, etc., etc. This is an all-in figure of £80 an acre. It will be capped at £120,000 per claimant, which equates to 1,500 acres of lower lying land, or good arable land, good grassland. I don't think it would apply to Bodmin Moor. That would probably fall into the next category down, which would pay at £64 an acre, but I'm not certain about that.
Okay.
And genuine hill and mountain land would be £11 an acre. So obviously the £120,000 stretches over more acres in that case. Now, one of the reasons that we're capping this is not just to save money, it's to try and stop the trend that more and more public money, or the same very large pot of public money, is going into fewer and fewer and fewer hands.
Right.
As farms get larger, this is happening. By capping it like that, if a 2,000 acre farmer is convinced that he cannot make money on that last 500 acres, then there's an opportunity for him to let it to somebody who can claim. He can then charge them a rent which reflects the fact they're getting that subsidy. And so he ends up with some money for doing nothing and taking no risks, which he may like.
Yes.
The tenant farmer who takes it on gets the opportunity of a lifetime, something he would have given his right arm for. Now, that may be a relative, more than likely, but it may be a farm manager or a shepherd who's got the chance to start farming on their own account. And that, for them, is something they've always wanted to do. And, of course, the taxpayer who's funding this feels that they're contributing to some social mobility in agriculture, which is what we haven't got at the moment.
Right.
So that's one reason for doing it. Also, the whole purpose of having a single farm payment, well, it's twofold. It's A, to be able to remain competitive with the European Union. We can't just walk away and leave our farmers high and dry. But the other reason is that £120,000 should keep the business going when years are very bad.
Yeah.
So when times are good and you're profitable, that single farm payment will help you to reinvest for the future. When times are bad, that will help keep body and soul together and keep the payments going for hire purchase, etc.
If I've got my facts right, I understand that there's a piece of pie from which money is distributed to farmers right throughout the EU, the European Union, and certainly France gets the largest share of that. However, with more and more countries adding, how is that affecting our piece of the pie, and how much historically has that amount of money reduced over the years anyway that's going for farm subsidies?
Well, a pie is quite a good way of describing it. We say that that's your pie, and then the agricultural share of that pie in the past was all of this.
Yes.
It's over 80%.
Over 80, right.
The pie has been growing up until recently. It's been growing purely because there are more member states involved. Now, however, some of these member states are finding it difficult to afford to keep putting money into the European Union, and there's some resistance against doing it.
Right.
So that overall pie might shrink. But crucially, the slice of that pie devoted to agriculture is really shrinking rapidly. So it was 80%, it's now down to under half.
Really?
And that dynamic is likely to continue because there's a lot of pressure on this EU budget. That is why, in the last parliamentary term, when we were doing the reform of the CAP, we had this greening because the Commission as a whole said, unless that policy is very, very green, you will lose your budget.
Right.
And some of these green policies are simply impractical and counterproductive and don't really help anybody. So the future, from that point of view, is not good. As I keep saying to farmers, you've had the best of this,
yes.
72 to 84. We're now in a sort of mid-term where it's okay, you might say, but it's getting worse. That's the problem.
Right. So if UKIP got its way, and we hope it will, and that we do pull out of the EU, what would be the ramifications on the countries that are left?
That would be a big problem to them, because in order for our farmers to get about £3.5 billion, our taxpayers have to put in about £7 billion.
Right.
Which means there's about £3.5 billion left there, and that goes to subsidising farmers in poorer countries. If we pull out, that £3.5 billion that used to be left there won't be left there anymore. It won't be going in the first place, and they will have to reduce payments to farmers in those countries. So for those farmers here in Cornwall who are still frightened that the EU farmers will get a better deal, actually they won't. For that reason alone, it will trim their sales.
And just part of it, is it fair, in your opinion, that France, which is 4 times the size of England, gets such a large line share of European funding for agriculture?
Well, it is actually done on an area basis now. They're all having to move to an area basis, so it should, in theory, be pro rata.
Okay.
But they have had 1 or 2 privileges. They're able to pay headage payments on animals. The WTO, the World Trading Organization, doesn't like headage payments. That's so much per sheep or so much per cow. But they do allow a little bit of this, and they have a quota. And it seems that France has grabbed most of that quota.
Right.
Whereas we, in our agricultural policy, under the WTO rules, we can support farmers in upland areas by having some headage payments, and we're committed to doing this, which will help a little bit.
Stuart, there's this thing that I call a rotation policy, but other people call it, is it a 3-crop rotation policy?
It's called the 3-crop rule. It's part of the greening rules that farmers have to adhere to in order to get the single farm payment.
Right.
And it's complicated. The 3 crops must be in a certain proportion to one another. And it can create problems where you might have a crop failure.
Yeah.
And a crop that was sown in the autumn fails, you need to re-drill in the spring, and you may not be able to get the seed.
Yeah.
You may be forced to drill another crop, which throws you the wrong side of the rules. Now, for many grassland farms, initially this looked absolutely devastating, because grass didn't count as a crop. So if they just ploughed 10 acres of their 200-acre farm, whatever it was, to put in some swedes or some barley, by just putting in that 1 crop, they then had to put in 2 more, because they got 1.
Right.
Through a lot of lobbying which I was involved in, we've managed to dilute that a little bit so that the farm, where this kicks in now, the farm's a bit bigger, about 70 acres, but that's still a small farm by British standards, but it's a big farm by European standards. Right. This is a problem we're up against, is that we're always having to have rules that are aimed at different sorts of agriculture instead of our own.
So one size doesn't fit all.
So it creates problems for small grassland farmers who now, yes, grass can count as a crop, so if they then grow barley in order to feed their cattle or to get a bit of income from a cash crop, they've got to grow barley plus something else. And if they're not used to doing this, it can cause them problems. This whole thing has been made more difficult by bans on certain chemicals, agrochemicals, which can make growing these crops a lot more difficult now if you haven't had the experience of doing it. And so this is a worry. Farmers are having to change the way they farm purely because of a subsidy and not because of demand for their product or what their land will naturally do.
Right. Okay, thank you. I've been told by many farmers that the imposition of all this regulation really is so burdensome they might as well just give up. So really the question is, what can UKIP do, what will UKIP do to help relieve that?
Well, we can do quite a lot, actually. Nearly all of these regulations stem from Europe. I mean, they're called regulations. That's a hint in that word, which means once the Commission decides them, they're law in every member state the next day.
Yeah.
Technically. Right, what's the first one we can do away with? Electronic identification of sheep. I have already mentioned that. Then, of course, there's the issue of fallen stock. Farmers don't like animals dying on their land. That represents a dead loss. Before the EU got involved, they simply buried them on the farm. Yes. And after all, badgers lie where they die, foxes lie where they die, deer lie where they die. Burying something is not exactly an environmental catastrophe. Right. With the earth gives and the earth receives. However, the EU had decided that we must not bury fallen stock. That means the farmer has to pay to have these animals collected and taken to an incinerator where they're roasted at 900 degrees centigrade. This is all in the name of global warming, you understand? Yeah. And then he sent a bill which can be anything up to £60 for an animal, which is quite a lot. Well, we can relieve them of that burden. The only criteria we would introduce is that you must not threaten or pollute a watercourse where you bury the animals. And in most farms, there's somewhere where you can find to do that. There's something else that's been overhanging farmers, and that is this issue of chrysotile, otherwise known as white asbestos cement or roofing sheets. And I should think there are hundreds of acres across the country, literally hundreds of acres on the sides and the roofs of buildings. Because the word asbestos is included in the general name, this material, chrysotile, is bracketed together with brown asbestos and blue asbestos, which were genuinely very dangerous toxic materials. Because of that, somebody can claim on a farmer saying, oh, he handled a roofing sheet 30 years ago, now he's very ill and coughing terribly, he wants money. And the farmer then has an ambulance chasing lawyer to cope with.
Yes.
It's very stressful. Also, if a farmer wants to get rid of some of this material, a building is tumbling down, he has to get very expensive waste contractors to come in who charge a fortune to move this stuff, which actually is chemically very similar to talcum powder.
Yes.
So we, UKIP, want to reclassify that. We want to be able to take back control of labelling so that if the consumer wants to see that excuse me, British milk really is British milk, it's labelled loud and clear as such. At the moment, we have to ask the EU's permission to use the term Cornish pasties for a local. You have to get the EU's permission for what you want to put on a label, and they do not like any country highlighting nationalism. They don't like that. And many consumers in this country want to back British farmers, and they want to know what British produce is. So that's something, that's another rule that we can bring in. There's another problem we've got, not so bad in the west of England, and that is the NVZ rules, nitrate vulnerable zone. All water contains some nitrate naturally in it.
Yeah. Farming
activities can increase the quantity of that goes into the groundwater and the rivers. Before the EU got involved in this, we had a limit in this country, a maximum of 100 milligrams of nitrate in a litre of water. And that limit prevented us getting the problems associated with high nitrate levels in water, such as blue baby syndrome. The EU have halved this maximum down to 50, which is very bad news in the east of the country, not quite such bad news here. But because of our fens there and the very chalk soils, they tend to be naturally higher in nitrate. And getting down to that level of 50 is proving impossible. Well, we want to have a proper scientific look at this whole issue.
Right.
And if science says that you really don't need to go over the top with a maximum level of 50, a maximum level of 75 would be okay. We might get back up to 100, but science must lead. This is the important thing, science must lead. Yes. Finally, and this is very important to all farmers, but particularly arable farmers, the way the EU now assess the danger of pesticides, they're using something called a hazard-based approach. Now, anything can be hazardous, really, and look at petrol. Petrol's highly hazardous, but we accept that the risk of that hazard becoming a calamity is not greater than the benefit of using petrol. Yeah. And as long as we handle petrol properly, we consider that the risk is an acceptable risk. The EU are now looking at a great raft of active ingredients in agricultural pesticides and saying, well, that's hazardous, we're going to ban that. That is going to make life very difficult for farmers, and it will be a process that's ongoing over the next few years. So I think that's 6 examples I've given you. Yeah. Between them, they do add up to quite a lot.
Stuart, thank you very much indeed for giving us your time this afternoon and letting us obviously find out and plummet the depth of your incredible knowledge and wisdom. And let's hope people listen and take note.
Well, thank you for somebody who isn't a farmer having such a good grasp of things. I'm very impressed.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.